Hey there, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. This is your host, Stephen Bauman. And this week we have a guest who is a friend of the show. I first met at Temple University when I was doing coursework. He's now Dr. Steve Houseman, Assistant Professor of History at the University of St. Thomas. Not only that, but he's also a podcast host over at the New Books Network and an expert on the American West. So we have a fascinating conversation to share with you today. It's of interest to anyone who wants to know a little bit more about the business, how to be successful, and just some good tips for studying, working, and being an awesome person like Steve Houseman is. It was a pleasure to have him on the show, and it's a pleasure to have you listening. Remember to head over to hourofhistory.com/subscribe so you get notifications of every great new episode we have for you on every single Saturday. Thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, and welcome to the Hour of History. It's good to have you, Dr. Steve Houseman.
Hi, Steve. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we go way back to Temple University, but for people who aren't familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your history, Steve?
My history. Like you said, I also did my PhD at Temple University. I just finished up this past March. I defended my dissertation. Prior to that, I did my MA and my BA at the University of Vermont, and I grew up in New York State, in Rochester, and I kind of got the history bug at a very early age, playing a lot of history video games, like the Civilization series, for instance. So once I found out that you could do history as a career, once I was in college and taking history classes, I found out it was a thing that someone would pay you to do. I sort of was on that track from that day forward.
That is very cool. And I mean, because usually, we hear about an inspiring teacher or something, but video games can be great teachers as well.
And I had my fair share of inspiring teachers, both at Temple and at UVM and in high school. But for the listeners who might not know, the Civilization series, especially the earlier iterations, they came with encyclopedias that you would do something in the game and a link would pop up. You could click on it and learn about whatever the thing was that you were doing. So it was a good gateway into history for me.
And didn't that series also teach you that Gandhi was an extremely important military leader?
Yeah, it did. And that, that Napoleon lived at the same time as Abraham Lincoln and as Julius Caesar, too. So historical accuracy wasn't always the name of the game, but for, a 8, 9, 10-year-old, it was a good way to start thinking about who these people were in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think of some of the games now that are starting to come out, like even Assassin's Creed, where you can walk around like these historically reconstructed cities. And even if it's not 100% accurate, as long as it sort of plants the seed, I think we're going to have great results. So tell us, first of all, I should have said before all that, congratulations on finishing. And tell us a little bit about what your specialty is and what your dissertation was.
Thank you for the congratulations, first of all. So my dissertation is, broadly speaking, it's an environmental history of the Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming. I'm interested in the intersection between the non-human environment with race and settler colonialism, and how those three elements kind of interact with one another to create historical change. That's sort of the big picture version of it. At the kind of more granular level, it's a history of Rapid City, South Dakota. So it kind of zooms in and out throughout the dissertation. But the crux point in the work, in my research, is a flood that happened in Rapid City in 1972. Rapid City it's not a huge city by any stretch, but it's the biggest city in the region for about 300 miles in any direction. So it's sort of the metropolis of the Northern Plains. It's a city of about 70,000 people or so. And in 1972, Rapid Creek flooded. There was a rainstorm and a dam burst, and the creek overflowed its banks very quickly and killed about 250 people. It was one of the largest flash flood disasters in American history up until that point. And one of the groups that was disproportionately affected, both in terms of lives lost, in terms of property lost, in terms of injuries, in terms of displacement, one of those groups was the Native community in Rapid City. One of the largest Native neighborhoods in Rapid City was right along the banks of Rapid Creek, a place called Oshkosh Camp. It was on Oshkosh Street is where that name comes from. And so my dissertation and my research more generally, as I turn it into a book proposal and hopefully soon a book, is kind of asking why those people lived in that place at that time. So that's sort of the entry point question that I go off of.
That's I mean, there's a lot of fascinating things there, but how do you get into this sort of environmental study, being from Rochester in Vermont? What brought you out to South Dakota? What brought you out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes I wish I had a more poetic answer to it, but in between, I mean, as much as I can tell, and it's a bit of a cliche, I gotta admit, but in between finishing up my master's at UVM in 2011 and starting at Temple in 2013, I lived with my girlfriend in Denver, Colorado. I just kind of worked jobs out there. I was sort of outside of the academic world for a couple of years. And we both really just kind of fell in love with the West, with the Rocky Mountain West, particularly, and with Denver, but we just loved living out there. So when I got to Temple, it quickly became apparent to me that I wanted to do some kind of work that dealt with the West, wherever that might be. Soon became sort of a question in and of itself, but I knew I wanted to work on the West somehow because I loved living out there so much. You know, working on that place seemed like a good way to get the opportunity to move back out there. So that was one reason why. And I just thought it was a fascinating part of North America with a fascinating history. So while I was casting about for dissertation topics, I started reading more about the Black Hills and about South Dakota. And I realized that I didn't know much about that part of the West outside of, Mount Rushmore and the TV show Deadwood. That was about all I really knew about the place. And the more I read about it, the more fascinating it got and the more troubling the history became to me in a lot of ways, especially as I learned more about this flood and about the racialized nature of this flood. So that's sort of a long way of saying that, I took kind of a circuitous route to get to this project. But I guess the grain of it is the seed was planted when I lived in the West and knew that I wanted to find out more about that part of the country.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see there's thankfully a lot of historians doing really great work on environmental issues, and especially when you see disasters, because it seems like there's always an environmental disaster happening in the news. Have you found this satisfying environmental history? What doors has it opened for you for a field that not everyone might know a lot about?
Well, one of the ways, and this is a little grim, but as the climate changes, as it has been doing over the past 25 plus years, and as it continues to do, there are more disasters. As people are living in places where they haven't lived before, as human infrastructure encroaches on places where there has been less human infrastructure historically. And as the climate changes, there's more extreme weather. So there are more disasters. So one of the things that I think is most important about the research that I'm doing and that people that are doing like studies are working on is pointing out to people that, disasters don't affect people equally. That every disaster that harms a person or that destroys something is a tragedy, but that tragedy is often placed unequally on the burden of people that are oppressed by the systems that exist in a settler colonial nation state like the United States. So that's something that needs to be thought about and addressed as the climate continues to change and as disasters become more frequent, is who are the people that are going to bear the brunt of these disasters. So in the case of Rapid City in 1972, like I said before, disproportionately the people that were affected were Native people living in Rapid City. And so again, that raises questions about what will happen as floods and as fires continue to happen and continue to get worse. Who will be affected by those? So I think that for that reason alone, environmental history is one of the most, what's a good word? I guess pressing fields of history that someone can study.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think every time I talk with someone about environmental history, I always want to go deeper and learn more. With that in mind, did you find yourself being pulled back further into the past or closer to the present in this project as you were working along? Because you have that key event, but it seems like it's going to pull you in both directions pretty drastically.
Yeah, so the dissertation begins in, I begin in the far distant past, talking about why the Black Hills are there in the first place, why in the Northern Plains, which is a pretty arid, pretty dry region, broadly speaking, why there are all these river systems and all these creeks and why it is such a place that has drawn people to living there for tens of thousands of years. And then my story really picks up in the mid-1850s when there is increased encounter and contact and soon warfare and bloodshed between the United States and indigenous societies living on the Northern Plains, like the Cheyenne and the Lakota and the Kiowa. But like you said, it goes all the way up until I think the dissertation ends in 1981. And it's funny you ask about whether I was drawn, more to the present or more to the more distant past, because I'm trained as an early Americanist, and my master's thesis was actually about infrastructure construction in late 18th and early 19th century New England. And as I just started, and I did all of my comps in 18th and 19th century history, but as I started reading more about this project and going through the archives, I just kept being drawn closer and closer to the present. So I guess that's just kind of what happens when you really sink your teeth into a project, is you just follow the documents wherever they take you. And for me, it took me up until, just a few years before I was born.
It is fascinating. It kind of becomes like this really long history. This is what I've found certainly with environmental histories, is because there's the land there. And you mentioned one thing in the beginning about the non-human environment. So when you're saying that, you're talking about nature. What kinds of nature?
I like to make... Sorry, what'd you say?
What kind of natures appear in your dissertation?
Sorry. I like to make that distinction because, environmental historians always really like to point out and to emphasize that, people are embedded within environments as well. So when we talk about, when we just say things like the environment, sort of unthinkingly, there's sort of an implication in there that sort of is removed from people. Whereas when we say the non-human environment or the human environment, I feel as though that sort of shows that, they are both part of the same thing. They're both environments. People are a part of this environment. But if we're talking about the non-human environment, then that sort of emphasizes that we're talking about things that happen without humans necessarily affecting them. So that's why I like to make that distinction. But if we're talking about the Black Hills, the non-human environment in the Black Hills, the mountains themselves, the fact that there are all these creeks and streams that flow out of the mountains and into this large array of river systems that sort of encompass the Black Hills themselves, and all of the flora and fauna that live in there that have drawn people to that region for so long. The Black Hills are an intensely wooded area. They're pretty tall mountains too. The highest is somewhere in the vicinity of 7,000 feet. So it's something like the tallest mountain between the Pyrenees and the Rockies. So we're talking about, in some cases, some pretty almost alpine environments. And the beauty and the natural richness and wealth of the region has drawn people there for centuries.
And the people are drawn there, and you used what seems a kind of benign word, interacting with each other. What sort of interactions are we seeing?
Oh, it depends on when you are talking about. Certainly people have fought over the Black Hills region for as long as people have been in that region. But when French explorers first came through that region in the early to mid 18th century, they passed through pretty peacefully. The first European accounts of the Black Hills come from, I think, the 1740s, and it's from these French explorers. I'm going to mispronounce their name, but it's something like the Vérandry brothers. They are traveling through the region with native guides, and they comment on these hills in the far distance, and they move on. It's not until you get to really the mid-19th century when you have American settlers that are crossing through Lakota and Cheyenne territory in large wagon trains that are disrupting buffalo herds and are disrupting the non-human environment in ways that were not sustainable, that you start to see a lot more bloodshed in the region between Americans and Lakotas. You have Lakotas in particular basically taxing, or what I call it in my dissertation, I call it levying a toll essentially on settlers that are passing through, where they would stop them and they would take things. They would, in their logic, they were saying, you're passing through our territory. We have sovereignty in this space. This is my words, not theirs. But we have sovereignty in this space. If you're going to pass through, we want something in return because you're disrupting our entire economic system in certain ways by doing this. And so, settlers are not too pleased about this. They get pretty upset, and they call on the army to help them out. And that begins this cycle of bloodshed that takes place between the 1850s and the late 1870s when the United States does conquer the Black Hills region militarily.
And so in a lot of ways, you have to be kind of an expert on the environment. You have to know what kind of land the people are using and how they're using it. You have to know people and cultures and the interactions there. You have to know militaries. What kind of sources were you using for your dissertation? It sounds like it could be massive.
Yeah, my advisor, when I first pitched this project as an environmental history to him, he said, the great thing about environmental history is that if you're a naturally curious person, then you're going to have to read a whole lot of stuff because you'll find that everything is connected to everything else, and you're going to be reading in a wide array of disciplines. So that definitely held true with this project. My archival base, it stretched across a few different archives and a few different places and a few different document sets. Particularly in the later period, in the 20th century, I used the archives in the Library of Congress. The guy that designed Mount Rushmore by the name of Gutzon Borglum, all of his papers are there. So it's an interesting name. His parents were Danish. And his papers have a lot of information about the construction of Mount Rushmore, about the ideology behind Mount Rushmore, and about tourism in the region in general. So for a lot of the early 20th century portion, I spent a lot of time in the Library of Congress. I took several trips out to the South Dakota State Archives and various archives in and around the Black Hills, both for the Gold Rush period in the 1870s and 1880s, as well as for the period surrounding the flood in the 1970s, and trying to get into the history of urban Rapid City in the 1950s and 60s. A lot of that was on the ground in Rapid City. But in the mid-19th century, I did a lot of work on microfilm, looking at government documents, wherever they happen to be held. Some were in the Library of Congress, some were in South Dakota, some were at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and just looking at accounts from military officials that were talking about what they were seeing and about their interactions, both peaceful and non-peaceful, with Native people. I did a lot of oral history work, not taking them myself, although I hope to do that for the book project, but there is a large oral history database online for the 1972 Rapid City flood. So I used that a lot as well when I was working on and writing about the flood. So a whole array of sources that took me all over the country, really.
Wow. And it seems like you really are staking your claim and becoming an expert on the Black Hills. Like, they must really appreciate you over there.
I like to think so. I'm certainly not alone in doing research on the Black Hills these days. There's a historian, Elaine Nelson, who is doing similar work on a slightly earlier period, and she's at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And there's a few people that actually live in and around the Black Hills that are doing continuing work on Native land rights in Rapid City and in the Black Hills. Eric Zimmer in Rapid City is one. Heather Dawn Thompson, I think she's based in Chicago. And I've done some collaboration with them as well. So I'm, I like to think that my work is helping in some way, but I'm certainly not alone in being interested in this time period and in this place right now.
That's very cool. And one of the things that I really appreciate about you and just the sort of way that you approach this is that collaborative aspect you have. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the Hour of History so much is because you seem to have been very driven and very successful in this project. And I'm wondering if you could sort of take us through just the conception of the project, how you sort of went through graduate school, began to uptake this project, go to different archives. For a lot of people who are maybe getting past the comps level or beginning to start to write or at an intermediate stage in the PhD, what sort of tips do you have for that?
Well, it's not easy. Sometimes from the outside, when you see someone complete a project, you don't see all of the bumps in the road and the knots that they had to untangle along the way. It just looks like they were someone that was out there and they were working on it, and then the thing got done. And, how about that? But, it's definitely not an easy thing to do, writing a dissertation. So, I guess the first thing I would say is that if you're someone that is in a position that you just described, and you feel like you're struggling, then that's normal too. Because there were times when I was banging my head against the wall working on this thing. But to kind of get at your question of the kind of narrative of the project itself, so I needed to be pretty flexible in my my experience in graduate school. Like I mentioned a little while ago, I went to Temple, with some training as an early Americanist. I thought I wanted to do work writing about the history of the national road and infrastructure in the early Republican Jacksonian period. But soon after I got to Temple, my original advisor actually took a different job. And he left Temple after a year of advising me. So I was left, and certainly he was willing to continue to advise me from afar. But I eventually found Drew Eisenberg, who I'd taken a class with, and he said that if I picked a topic that was sort of within his purview, within his wheelhouse, that he would happily advise me. So that, again, started to get me thinking about the West again, since he's a historian of the West, and what I could do that might kind of both satisfy my interest in the region as well as have an advisor that was, present at Temple at the same time. So I needed to be flexible. I did not end up doing a dissertation in the field that I originally ended up working on. As far as conceiving the project goes, I really just started thinking about places in the West I didn't know that much about. And, I originally started thinking about southern Colorado, but in order to really do work in that area, I needed to speak Spanish, and I don't speak Spanish. So I started, again, thinking about South Dakota as a possibility. And I just took a couple books out of the library that were histories of the Northern Plains and just started to see what was out there. So the summer after I did my comps, it was just a lot of thinking about questions that interested me, about places that interested me, and just, doing a little bit more of that kind of grad school style reading where I would take a book out of the library, see what it said pretty briefly, pretty quickly, and see if there was anything in there that kind of caught my eye. I feel like I'm kind of rambling here. What else? What was the other part of the question?
I think these are great tips, and I think they're widely applicable. Like, you mentioned the advisor going to a different school. I think this happens in a variety of fields. It happens all over the place. Now, whether you're going to a PhD or not, and it's interesting, that you didn't just kind of throw your hands up and say, "Well, I'm not doing a project on this anymore." You kind of looked. And so I think these are valuable sort of ideas. Then the next stage of the exploration and actually taking time and thinking practically about, should I do a project here or should I do a project there? Yeah. But so along this process, and this is another thing that I think it's good that you bring up, because I think a lot of people have this sort of misconception that you, Steve Houseman, always knew you were going to write about the Black Hills. And
no way.
Yeah. So tell us maybe how did you go then from this exploratory period to saying, I mean, this is a big commitment. This is saying, okay, I'm going to spend years with you, Black Hills.
Yeah. part of it. So there's a couple ways that I kind of ended up committing to this project. A good advisor is someone that when you pitch an idea to them, will find something that is interesting. They'll help you see what is interesting in your idea. Because, if you are someone that's just out of your comps, you're still learning what it is to ask good historical questions. And a good advisor is someone that can kind of nudge you in that direction. So I don't remember what I originally pitched to Drew about my Black Hills project. It was something, another one of my dissertation committees said that it sounded like a hippie wrote it or something. It was much more, I think the exact words were, he sounds like you should be talking about crystals or something in here. Which is to say that it was pretty unclear what I was talking about. But my advisor, he said, there are like 3 interesting things that you're talking about in here. There's the environmental history aspect of it. There is the continued presence of Native people in Rapid City that's interesting. And there's this disaster studies aspect. So if you can find something that combines all of those within this kind of larger project, then that's something to be thinking about. So Drew kind of pushed me a little bit towards finding what was interesting within this kind of larger, much more complicated, much more unwieldy project. So I guess the first thing I would say is, make sure that you have a good advisor. That's someone that is good at doing that, because it's important when you're just starting out of this project to have someone kind of looking over your shoulder when you want them to in order to say, this is worth pursuing. This is going to be, maybe more of a dead end, just to kind of, again, nudge you in the right direction. But the other part of it, which was more sort of my own volition, was just going into the archives and seeing what was there. On my very first research trip I went to the E.Y. Berry Library at Black Hills State University in Spearfish, South Dakota. And I'd gotten a little bit of funding, I think, from Temple to do research out there. And the archives there had a ton of material about the flood. So, prior to that research trip, this was probably back in, I think, the summer of 2016 or the spring of 2016. Well, prior to that research trip, I knew that the flood would be a part of my dissertation. The fact that on my first trip, I found this treasure trove of documents relating to the flood really kind of secured its place as the primary focus of the dissertation, as the thing that I was going to spend, several chapters leading up to and really dive deep into. So, besides having an advisor that can help to guide you, the other thing is let the archive guide you. Let the archive tell you where the story is going, because, you're not making up the story. You're you're interpreting the documents that you have. And yeah, that was a big part of it for me as well.
Yeah, and at that crucial point of you going to the archive and getting these materials, you're beginning to do something that has to last you for a long time in the sort of like collection, cataloging, processing, and writing of the documents that you see. So how did you interact with this flood of documents?
One might say. Well, I'll admit right off the bat that it's something that I feel like is one of my weaker points as a historian. I wish that, and I feel like this is the case across PhD programs. So I don't mean this is a knock against Temple or anything like that, but I wish that I had gotten a little bit more hands-on training on just how to collect archival material, because I hadn't had a lot of training. I had really just talked to a couple other people and said, hey, how do you do this? And gotten some tips and just kind of work based on that. And so I'm constantly feeling like I just barely have my hands around my documents, because I feel like I've never really been as good at organizing them as I want to be. What I do is I just take a lot of pictures. I take pictures of any document that I come across that seems even remotely related to my project. And then in a perfect world, when I go back to the hotel at night from the archive, but more reasonably, it usually happens when I get back from the research trip, I will go through all those pictures and I will tag them. And I'm sure that there are more high-tech ways of doing it, but I basically just have a Word document for every day in the archive. That's how I organize them. And I just assign a few tags for every image. And then when I am, writing something, say, about the flood, and I want to, write something about the dam collapse. Then I can just run a search on my own computer for, dam collapse and flood, and all the documents that I've tagged with that will come up. It's not the best way of doing it. I would love to, get emails or hear from people about better ways of doing this, because I feel like it's not the most efficient way, but it's the way that has worked for me so far.
Yeah, and I think, well, it's always changing with technology too, because there was a time when you couldn't take photos of archival materials, but now the archive trips sort of become like these raids that you're doing on these libraries.
Yeah. I don't know how people used to do it before that. It's shocking.
A lot more writing.
A lot more writing.
Yeah, speaking of which, so as you're going through this process, were you one of those people who gets the documents and then you write as much as you can about the documents, or did you get them and think about them and consider them and then maybe outline something? How did you approach the whole writing process?
I tried to be someone that when I was in the archive, and actually this is more how I did it with my master's thesis, was I did a lot of writing in the archive with the documents in front of me. But for one reason or another, maybe my brain just changed. It didn't work as well for me on the dissertation. So for me, what worked, and anyone that is listening and is a writer knows that everyone does it differently. But for me, what worked best was setting very easy to attain goals for myself every day. I had the goal of writing one page. I set a page at about 300 words worth of writing every single day, which is a really bare minimum amount that you could do. And it didn't have to be any good. As long as it was just a page a day, then it was a successful day. And that meant, days when I was on research trips, days when I was teaching, no matter what, just a page a day. And I found that worked for me for a couple reasons. For one thing, because it was such a kind of a low stakes threshold, if I missed a day, even if I missed 2 days, that would still be a pretty attainable amount of words to make up on day 3, where I could, write 3 pages on a Wednesday, even if I had missed writing a page on Monday and Tuesday. And it just kept me going. I just always knew I had to get a little bit of work done every single day, so there weren't really periods where the project lay completely fallow for like a long stretch of time. I was always having some kind of forward momentum. It was really helpful for me to see the various drafts. I would save a draft every single day, and it was really helpful just from a morale perspective to see those drafts pile up. So again, everyone does it differently, and some people do it in ways that might be completely different. But for me, what worked really well was just having a very low word count goal every single day and just trying my best to meet it. And, it worked out in the end for me anyway.
So save a draft every day. You mean like so you would have thousands of drafts at this point?
Yeah, I have a lot.
And,
but,
you never like sort of like, how do you categorize it? Or I guess you're just building on it every day. No,
yeah, I mean, it would just be, it'd be chapter 3, draft 4, May 27th, 2017. And then the next day, or let's say I skipped a day, then it would be chapter 3, draft 4, May 29th. And I just have a whole folder with just a bunch of those.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, I feel like I'm revealing all my horribly disorganized computer secrets here. I don't know how I feel about this.
Personally, I think you're going to help a lot of people with this sort of thing because because we do see, and you see it a lot on Twitter, and Twitter is one of those communities that can be the most helpful thing or it can be the least helpful thing. And sometimes when historians and writers are talking about writing, they're talking about these X amount of word goals that are just huge, like a ton of words. And I'm thinking, well, unless I'm having a really, really good day, I'm not going to meet that. And then I'm probably going to be disappointed that I didn't meet my goal. So it's very interesting to hear. And then you kept it going. So you kept the project rolling. What do you remember any times when the project sort of went off the rails a little bit, or did you really just steamroll straight through?
I'd have to think about that. A time when it really went off the rails. I don't know about went off the rails, but particularly in the earlier time period of my project, when I'm writing about the 1850s up until like the late 19th century. And I wrote my paper, or excuse me, I tried to just write my dissertation basically just chronologically, just start with a draft of the intro and just work from there. And I guess that's one area where I ran into some trouble because, especially at first, I was finding mostly documents about the 20th century. I did research trips to the Historic Society of Pennsylvania and Philly, to the Newbury, to the Beinecke and Yale. And at a lot of these places, I was finding most of the stuff that was most relevant to my project was not relating to the earlier time periods I knew I needed to cover to lay the groundwork for what was going to come next. So that was very frustrating when I was trying to write this portion of the dissertation that I didn't really have I had plenty of secondary material, but not a lot of good primary material to really make it work the way I wanted to. So I ended up writing several drafts of chapters, really 1 and 2, that were pretty crappy in a lot of ways, just because the archives just weren't there for me. And eventually I cleared it up somewhat, but they're also, I would say, probably the weakest portion of the project to this point, because I just found so much richer and so much more material in the in the 20th century. So I don't really know if that counts as off the rails, but it was certainly frustrating for especially the earlier period of my writing, when I was trying to get these first couple chapters just complete in a way that I was happy with, and I just didn't have a lot of the material that I really wish that I had had.
Wow. Yeah. And so the important thing, it sounds like you just kept going with it. How often did you get other eyes on your writing? How often did you share your drafts and your work?
As often as people were willing to read it. I mean, so my advisor would read every chapter draft and give pretty detailed feedback. And then I used as much outside feedback as I could muster. At Temple, one of my mentors there, historian named Jess Roney, she put on, I think still puts on, like a bi-weekly or monthly kind of, it's sort of like a pseudo writing seminar / sometimes speaker series, where she would allow grad students like myself to present our work in a pretty rigorous fashion, where people would give some pretty heavy duty critiques of it. But I took part in a couple of those, is what I'm saying, and my papers or my chapters always emerged much better for them. So my advisor was one element. I took advantage of any kind of collaborative opportunity like that I could. And while I was still present at Temple, when I still lived in Philly, I had a weekly writing group that had kind of a revolving cast of people involved in it, but sort of at a core of a few of us that were that had entered Temple at around the same time. And we, every month or so, I'd need to present something, which was helpful because on the one hand, that kind of kept me honest. It meant that I needed to make sure that I had, a full half of a chapter draft, like I said I would, by the time that it was my turn to present next. And it was really good to have kind of a group of people I felt safe presenting and talking about pretty rough writing with. So the weekly writing group that I had at Temple was really helpful. Taking advantage of opportunities that were put on by mentors and professors at Temple was helpful. And just whenever if someone said, "Hey, Steve, will you read a copy of such and such for me?" I'd always say, "Sure, as long as you'll read something of mine." And that happened pretty frequently in graduate school. So whenever I just had the opportunity for someone to read it, I would just send it out there. And all of those things made my paper made my dissertation so much better.
Yeah. And one of the things I always sort of looked up to you as doing, and I thought was so cool, is that here you were auditing classes and stuff that just interest you, just sitting, you think, oh man, he's got to be busy. He's teaching, doing all this stuff, and you're reading extra books and putting forth material, leading discussions. It's awesome. One of the things that you got into and that you do that I'm sure has contributed, that maybe you can talk about a little bit, is you too host a podcast.
Yeah. Well, before I talk about that, just really briefly, you mentioned auditing classes, and that is something that I did both at Temple after I was done with my coursework, and then I took a part-time teaching job at the University of Pittsburgh. I've taught there for the last couple of years, and I sat in a couple classes there too, and it's very low stakes. Like, the professors don't really expect that much of you. If you end up not reading the book, then, you're not really taking the class. You can sit there and just kind of listen to the discussion. If you can't make it one day, again, there's no stakes. So I found that was a really good way to kind of maintain a presence in the department and to, it's a kind of a rare thing to be able to take graduate courses with really high level historians and think really deeply about history and about historiography. And I felt like the longer I could prolong that feeling, the better of a historian I would be. So I just found that to be very useful for myself, even though, like you said, it did take up more time. But yes, the podcast is sort of a similar thing. So I'm one of the hosts for the New Books Network, which is a podcast, I guess you could call it like a consortium, that was founded, I think, 10 or 11 years ago by a historian. I think he's at Amherst College, but don't quote me on that. I should know. I feel bad that I don't. But a scholar named Marshall Poe. And his idea was to get academic work, stuff that people, that non-specialists probably won't sit down and read, a 400-page academic history. Some people will, and that's great, but the fact of the matter is that most people will not. And so his really, I think, pretty brilliant idea in the infancy of podcasting was to sit down with the author and get them to sort of give an hour-long digest version of the book. And that was 10 years ago. And at this point, the New Books Network has, something like 75 to 100 channels ranging all sorts of disciplines, from science fiction to history to environmental studies to I think there's one on systems analysis. And a couple years ago, when I was still at Temple, I realized that there was no history of the American West or American Western Studies channel. So I pitched the channel to Marshall, and he said, "Yeah, sure, go for it." And I've been hosting the podcast now since the summer of 2017. Every couple weeks, a new book arrives in my mailbox, and it's a way to get free books. It's a way to interact with other scholars in my field. I've made a bunch of really good connections through the podcast. I've put together a couple conference proposals through the podcast, and it's a really good way of staying up on the latest literature in the field. And as you know, Steve, podcasting is fun. It's a pretty informal medium. You just get to kind of sit and talk with interesting people that you get to hand select. So it's been a real pleasure to do it. And I'll make one more pitch for the New Books Network is, they're always looking for hosts. And the logistics are really easy, especially if you're affiliated with university. Most schools have some kind of small recording space you could use. And even if you're unaffiliated, a lot of places will just open them up to you. If you say, "Hey, I want to do a podcast," they're pretty open. I don't have to show my ID when I use the recording space, for instance, or anything like that. And the New Books Network is always looking for hosts. So if you're interested, send Marshall or myself an email. I can't recommend it enough. It's been a blast and a really good way to talk with some interesting people and get some free books. So yeah, it's been fun.
Absolutely. And this is just another one of those sort of examples of how you kind of reach out and make it just more than just this pursuit. I think a lot of people get into the sort of trap when they're writing the dissertation or even studying, or if they're not even an academic, just doing what they like to do, that they just have blinders on their own project. But the podcasting, and especially the New Books Network, if you subscribe, you see the, hundreds of podcasts that come out per week.
Yeah.
It's just the amount of information that's out there is absolutely extraordinary, and especially helpful too, to get to know these historians who are doing amazing work. So that's great. Now, one thing you mentioned back there was that you took time and you went and did a part-time teaching job at Pitt. Now, I had Herb Childress, who wrote this book about the adjunct underclass earlier on the podcast. And one of the sort of issues, one of the focuses is this contingent labor, and how it's a risky sort of decision for a PhD to get into is, will I ever get out of the part-time labor market? So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that job was, why you were willing to risk it, and how you turn that into a successful job search.
Yeah. So I kind of ended up in Pittsburgh by accident. My girlfriend, Monica, she got into med school at the University of Pittsburgh when we still lived in Philly. And once my funding at Temple ran out, she'd already lived out here for a year. I moved out to Pittsburgh since my teaching commitments at Temple, they disappeared along with the funding. So I moved to Pittsburgh, and it was really just, I don't know what you call it. I guess it was just luck. When I got here, I emailed the department chairs of all of the history departments in the greater Pittsburgh area. And I got a lot of people emailing me back saying, we'll keep your CV on file. Thank you for contacting me. Or, we don't really use a lot of adjunct labor, but again, thanks for contacting me. And I got a lot of rejections at first, but as you probably know, and as you talked about in that previous podcast that you mentioned, the thing with contingent labor is that it's contingent, and things pop up all the time, and there's classes that cancel or classes that open up, or teachers that for one reason or another can't teach a class suddenly. So I got a call from the University of Pittsburgh at the beginning of the summer, I think of 2017, saying we need someone to teach our Western Civ class. Would you be willing to teach it? And I had never taught Western Civ before. I was pretty skeptical, and still am pretty skeptical of the concept of Western Civ as it is. And to Pitt's credit, I think they're trying to phase that course out. But yeah, I just the opportunity fell in my lap, and I took it. And I really can't say enough good things about the University of Pittsburgh History Department. They teach their non-tenured track labor force extraordinarily well in terms of benefits, in terms of office space, in terms of just consistency of teaching opportunities and of pay. We're invited to, but not required to, attend all the faculty meetings and faculty events. So we're just, They really do a really good and commendable job, and really, I think, should serve as a model for how to include non-tenured track faculty within the culture and the body of the department itself. They really do a tremendous job there. So
yeah, and that's absolutely. I mean, it sounds like you had a opportunity, meeting, preparation there, so you were both working towards it, but also ready to take up that chance and teach something a little outside of your wheelhouse. But it seems like applying for a job, especially in such a difficult job market, is a full-time job as well.
Yeah, finishing my dissertation and teaching, I think either 2.2 or 3.3, whatever it was, course load at Pitt. While also applying for jobs was, it was pretty exhausting. it was a lot of work. I can't really mince words about it. But, and it's definitely true that it's easy to one good piece of advice I got early in graduate school was that teaching will take up as much time as you give it. So you really need to set boundaries around, and, the advice that I got was about teaching, but I think that is for all of the different aspects of one's academic life. So, I would have to set boundaries and say, okay, I'm going to work on, say, my dissertation for, only this long and not any longer, because otherwise I know I'll just keep on working on it and I won't get this other stuff done. Or I'm only going to do course prep for X amount of hours tonight, and if I can't go any more than that, because if I do, then I won't have any time for job applications. And, similarly, I'm only going to submit 2 applications tonight, because if I do more, then I'm not going to have time for anything else. Mm-hmm. And so it was about really setting those boundaries for myself that, helped me to balance all 3 of those things. But yeah, it's a lot of work, and it shouldn't be that way. It would be nice if, universities were willing to fund graduate students for longer, so that they didn't have to go out onto the contingent faculty job market in order just to, pay rent and make ends meet while they're on the job market. And there are certain, there's different levels of privilege that go into it as well. I mean, I live in a 2-income household. Mm-hmm. Where I had the benefit of, obviously getting paid for teaching was very helpful and even necessary at times in my household. But if I didn't get a teaching job for a semester, we would still be able to pay rent and keep the lights on and get food on the table. And not everyone is able to do that. So it's, there are realities in people's lives that make it even more difficult. And I was just fortunate that, I had another person to kind of go through this with me, but not everyone has that, and I recognize that too.
And so it sounds like, and throughout this conversation, it sounds like you've been very successful in setting goals for yourself and sticking to them. Is there any sort of like background to that you had, or is this just something like I know myself, I love planning. Like, it's just a hobby I have. Like, I just love to like sort of sketch out the next few weeks, but not everyone has that? How did it come for you? How did you learn this stuff?
It's funny that you say that. I don't feel like I'm particularly a good planner. I guess I could see, based on everything I've said for the last hour, that would definitely come across. But, there are a lot of scraps of paper and Word documents where I made a plan for myself that I did not stick to. Probably 3 of those for every plan that I did make that I did stick to. So, actually, just before I was talking to you just now, I was writing up a plan for the summer. I saw a tweet, actually. Some Twitter historian person was warning us all that there's only 12 weeks until fall semester begins.
Oh gosh.
I know, exactly. So I thought to myself, geez, I better put together a summer plan for myself since I don't have that much time. So I was doing that right before this call. But I wouldn't be surprised if the things that I have outlined for June 15th end up falling to July 1st, and the things I have for July 1st end up falling to July 15th. And I guess it's just not panicking when those changes need to be made, and maintaining some level of flexibility has been really helpful for me in my career. That's just been something that's helpful for me. But again, I've had certain opportunities and certain privileges that have allowed me to be more flexible than other people perhaps could be.
Absolutely. But how about one other sort of follow-up on that is how about the peace of mind? Where did you turn, and what did you do when it got too stressful, or when you had to push back the deadline? Because you've talked a lot about scheduling, and it sounds like you were pretty much teaching, applying, writing, that's more than full time, obviously. But how did you escape this project or get that peace of mind?
I'm not, believe it or not, a particularly social person by nature. Usually I need to kind of work up some energy if I'm going to talk with people or to seek out advice. But that was one of the things that I tried to do, is to kind of push myself outside my comfort zone and make sure I had mentors and people that I could ask questions and that I could turn to when I was, a lot of this job is rejection. Like, you apply for a lot of fellowships and a lot of conferences, and you send papers out there, and a lot of them get rejected. And if you don't have people that you can turn to and discuss those rejections with, that will tell you that it's, natural and part of the process, then it's easy to internalize it and take those very personally. So, I had Monica, my girlfriend. She helped me a ton all the time. She was always supportive and always helped me to keep perspective and recognize that, being a historian is a part of my life, but it is not all of my life. Mm-hmm. I had a lot of friends that I could do non-academic, non-history stuff with in general. And, I had people both at Temple and then later on at Pitt where if something wasn't going right, or if I was frustrated, which was often, I could turn to and talk about it with. And that was really helpful for me, was finding sort of surrogate advisors, or finding mentors outside of my home department who could kind of help me with this process, because it's all very opaque and it's all very frustrating. And it's helpful to have someone to kind of be a guiding light for you when need be.
That's awesome. Now, we're drawing close to the end, and so there's 2 parts to this. Normally, we have just the suggestion, so we'll start there, and then we'll add another little special bit to Hour of History. So first, if you could suggest anything to the listeners of the Hour of History podcast, anything in the world, Steve, what would you suggest?
Well, and especially thinking about your last question about, sort of how to not completely freak out and lose it when things aren't going well. Having interests outside of history is really important. And, sometimes just kind of turning your brain off and watching a TV show that is not about your dissertation topic is really helpful. And one show that in my house we got into over the last few months that was helpful as I was finishing up the dissertation, and it's just a wonderful show in general, is it's a show, I think it originally aired on the CBC in Canada, and now it's on Netflix, called Kim's Convenience.
Oh, yes.
You like Kim's Convenience? Yeah.
I've seen the theater version, yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, I forgot. It's based on a play. Well, the TV show is brilliant. It's funny and touching, and it's about a first-generation immigrant family in Toronto who run a convenience store, and it's a beautiful show. I really love it. It's funny and just really heartwarming, and I can only describe it as balmy. Like, it makes you just kind of feel good afterwards. So
that is great. Yeah, the great suggestion. Kim's
yeah.
convenience. And so my suggestion then is in the same vein. And just because you mentioned them at the beginning of the show, I didn't have this planned, but a video game, and a video game that has brought me great joy through the years is Smash Bros.
Yeah.
And you know, I've been able to play, and now I'm able to play remotely with friends from back home, and you know, I played many hours with my brothers growing up. So any incarnation of the Smash Brothers series is now, that one might not pique your interest in history, but it might free your mind a little bit from the worries of day-to-day life. Now,
Yeah.
the last section, if you will humor me trying this one out, is the biggest takeaway section. So I got this from actually the Side Hustle podcast, which if you're like looking for like new entrepreneurial activities is also a great podcast. But what he does at the end of every podcast is the biggest takeaway he got from the conversation. But I think it would be cool if we both did one. So I'll go first this time since this is experimental. But the biggest takeaway for me, just because of where I am in the process and where I am right now, is setting goals for writing every day that aren't necessarily massive goals or huge goals, but manageable goals, and meeting them every day was my biggest takeaway from your path to success that you've sort of demonstrated. So what would be a big takeaway? I know that you were presenting the information, but just thinking about sort of what you've talked about, what was a big takeaway from your own experience?
It's funny that you asked this question, because I've actually taken to asking a similar question on my New Books Network interviews, where I always ask the author at the end what one big takeaway is that they hope a reader gets from their book, and the authors hate that question. They always groan when I ask it because it's a hard question, and now I find myself sort of on the same hot seat. So
the turntables have turned. Yeah,
the tables have turned, exactly. I would say sort of a twofold answer. I'm trying to think about the right words to put this in.
Right.
Be flexible. Like, you know, if you have plans to go to a certain archive or to work on a certain project or to work with a certain person, you know, life happens to everybody that is involved in history, and sometimes those things don't pan out. And if they don't, that is not the end of the road or the end of the story for you. You got to be able to think, to kind of stay on your toes and be a little bit nimble if you're going to make it through this process. Because, and this is sort of the second half to that, the process of getting your PhD and working in history, whether it's in an academic or a non-academic capacity, is a very difficult road. And if you don't kind of have sort of a bendy backbone, and you aren't kind of nimble and willing to kind of go where the wind takes you, then it's going to be even more difficult. Now, like I keep saying and keep trying to emphasize throughout this, you know, some people, for any number of reasons, both, you know, systemic and institutional and otherwise, are more able of doing that than others. So I recognize that, but as much as you can, you got to be able to not take the bumps in the road and the hardships that you encounter personally, because they're sort of built into the process, unfortunately. And the way to deal with them is just to be as flexible as you can be. So, you know, not taking rejection as a personal affront to you, which took me some time to learn. And then, you know, making an alternate plan if you don't get a fellowship that you applied for, or if your paper that you produced was rejected to a journal. You know, that's going to happen to everybody. And so being able to adjust to those changing circumstances is really, really important.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Congratulations on finishing your dissertation. Congratulations on getting a job. And I very much look forward to having you back on the show once you've published this work, because it sounds absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Steve. It was a pleasure being on the Hour of History podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Thanks for listening.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.